8 steps to perfecting each scene and image when you're using OCF, off-camera flash, OCF. By the way, do not say OCF 10 times fast, because then it becomes something that's not so good. Okay, so what is this? This video, we're talking about basically our approach whenever we approach a scene in deciding whether we want to add light, how we want to add light, how we want to get to that final image. So it's starting from the very beginning all the way into working into that refined image. We've essentially narrowed it down into 8 primary steps, okay? And this is something to think through with every one of your shoots until it becomes second nature. All right, so let's start from the top with number 1, which is composition and attributes. Now, what we're saying here essentially is that when you approach any scene, the first thing that I want you to do is dial in the camera settings that relate to your composition or the composition that you desire. So for example, if I approach a scene and I want to shoot this beautiful wide landscape, then I probably want a deep depth of field, right? And to do that, I would close down my aperture. Or if I'm shooting portraits and I want to really create a lot of background separation, I might open up the aperture for a very shallow depth of field. Or let's say I'm capturing cars as they're driving by and I want to freeze all that motion as these sports cars race by on a track. Well, I'm going to speed up the shutter speed. If I want to capture and show that motion, then I'm going to slow down the shutter speed. These are the compositional attributes, the compositional settings that relate to what you are envisioning for your image. Those are the things that I want you to dial in before worrying about anything else. So if you're going into a scene and you're like, oh, I'm shooting my entire shoot and I want every one of my portraits to have that beautiful shallow depth of field look, then dial in your aperture to f2 and then start working through the rest of this process. But so number 1 is to dial in the compositional camera settings, the compositional attributes. Okay, so number 2 is synchronization, rear curtain sync, and first curtain sync. Now again, going back to Lighting 101, we talked about all of these things in complete detail. So I'm not going to go into the complete detail here, but let me give you a little summary. If our shutter speed is going above 1/200 of a second, that means that we either need to do one of 2 things. 1, we need to turn on high-speed sync on our flashes if that's available, if we're using full-feature flashes. If we're not using full-feature flashes, we need to be using neutral density filters to cut down the amount of light in the scene so that you can lower the shutter speed below 1/200 of a second so that your flashes can actually synchronize with that shutter speed, okay? Now there are merits to using neutral density filters even with full feature flashes, and the primary merit there is that when a full feature flash goes into high speed sync, you have a tremendous amount of light loss, anywhere between 4 to 7 stops of light loss. So to maintain power, you can use a neutral density filter and then cut down so that you can get to a sync speed that's below 1/200 of a second and not use high-speed sync on the flashes. Okay, again, for more detail on that, go back to Lighting 101. We compared all the merits on that side. Now, the next option that we have is rear curtain sync versus first curtain sync. Now, if our shutter speeds are relatively high, if we're working at 1/100 of a second, 1/200 of a second, around that area, it really does not matter that much unless your subject is moving very quickly. But when we start dragging out the shutter, when we start slowing it down to say 1/10 of a second, 1/30 of a second, I don't know why I started from a slower and then went faster. 1/30th, 1/10th, 1/5, 1 second. At that point, we need to decide, do we want the flashes to fire at the beginning when the shutter opens or at the end when the shutter closes? So for that, we would choose first curtain or rear curtain sync. So that's the thought process. Okay, step number 1, we dial in our compositional attributes. And then we look, if we're shooting at f2, then let's say that we're shooting at f2 and it's bright outside, we're at 1/2000th of a second. Well, as soon as I reach step 2, I go, crap, synchronization. I can't synchronize at 1/2000th of a second, I have manual flashes. Okay, I need to get my ND filter out. So you get your ND filter and now you've resolved step number 2. Or if you're doing a shutter drag, you figure out, okay, maybe I need to do rear curtain sync here so my flash fires at the very end of the frame. So you flip that, okay? So that's step number 2, is kind of getting the tech to work the way that you want it to. Step number 3 is dialing in the ambient light exposure and basically choosing your ambient to flash exposure. Again, in Lighting 101, we talked about this, and the summary to that is this. The less ambient light you have, so we have basically this little thing that says ambient less than flash equals more dramatic. That means that if your ambient light is less, it's darker than your flash power, that's when the overall image effect is going to be more dramatic. When ambient light is greater than flash power, so that your ambient light is much brighter and your flash is less powerful than ambient light, then you have a more natural effect. So once you have the text set up and when you've decided on your compositional attributes, at that point it comes time to, okay, let's balance now the flash versus ambient light. Let's get to that desired result that we want to have. Step number 4. At this point, we would decide what is the ideal light direction and quality that we want for this subject in this particular scene. So for example, most photographers, if you said, what's the best light quality possible? They would say, oh, I love my beautiful gigantic parabolic that's like 8 feet big and it creates this beautiful soft light and it's so amazing. Listen, there's no such thing as the right or the perfect light. There is only the right kind of light for the subject that you're shooting and for the vision that you have. So if I am shooting fitness photos, then the right kind of light for me is a harder and more specular light that's really going to cut out the definition in the body. If I'm shooting engagement portraits, the right type of light for me in those situations is a softer light and a light that's more simple and easy just to look at because we want it to be about the subject. We want it to look beautiful and light and airy and so forth. Same thing if I'm doing wedding portraits. If you're doing food photos or product photos, the right light is going to vary every single time based on the subject and the vision that you have for that subject. So at this point, step number 4, we've taken care of all the tech. We've kind of figured out what do we want that ambient to flash balance to be. And this is where we decide where do we want the light to come from and what quality do we want that light to be. Do we want it to be soft or hard? Do we want it to be diffused or specular? And so forth. Step number 5 is the test shot. Now, of course, throughout this entire process, generally we're taking shots just to kind of see where do we want the ambient exposure versus, everything. Where do we want, where's the initial kind of, I always take a shot when I approach a scene. I just go, what do I want my compositional attributes to be here? Do I want the blur? Do I want depth of field? Do I want those things? So I'm taking test shots throughout. But this is the test shot at number 5 where our light is set up, our subject or our test subject is in place. Everything is pretty much set at this point, and now we take the test shot just before we're going to start bringing in our model or our subjects and actually start shooting, basically. So at this point, what I'm looking at is just making sure everything is set appropriately, okay? So with this test shot, I'm looking at my ambient to my flash exposure. I'm looking at where my shadows and highlights are. I'm looking at my white balance. Is the white balance where I want it to be? Or do I need to make corrective white balance changes or stylistic white balance changes? And that takes us to step number 6. How is the light color and the white balance? There's plenty of scenes where I'll shoot it. I remember one from Lighting 101, basically, where we're shooting a model, Jill, on the beach, and I take my first shot and I'm like, you know what? I know for a matter of fact that I want to put a yellow light on Jill because I want to cool down the background. So I want to basically put a color temperature orange, a CTO gel onto my flash. I'm going to fire into a reflector, light her up so that she's orange. We're going to tone down the white balance in the camera so that it corrects for the light that I'm putting onto her skin. And then it sends the background into this deep blue. And the ocean looks amazing and it matches her bikini. It looks absolutely fantastic. And the reason why is because the shot that I took prior to that, where all the colors are warm, I just didn't really like it. I said, as soon as I took that test shot, I said, everything's great, except you know what? I really want a stylistic change in white balance. And so that's where we would do that with step number 6. Step number 7, we're into the shoot process. We are posing, we're framing, we're shooting. My advice to you is once you have the light set up, once you have the shadows and the highlights and everything is falling the way that you want it, start moving around, okay? Take your shots, move to different angles, switch out your lenses, try different things because most of the time, this is what I find on almost every one of my shoots. Most of the time I set up my first shot and it's what I would call basically my safety shot. It's the shot that I know is gonna work. It's my must-have. Right after that shot is set up, I start moving around the scene. Leaving the light and the model in the exact same position, I'm moving around the scene, I'm adjusting the model's pose and angle based on where I'm moving to, and I'm shooting different angles. Perfect example of this is a shot that we took again in Lighting 101 where we have our subject Jeremiah, who's holding onto these rods. We take this shot where he's holding onto this rig straight on, and it looks great. That's my safety shot, and I love it. It's a fantastic shot. Right after that shot was set up with our V-flats and everything in place, all I did was move my position just a little bit, and I shot through the rails. And we got my favorite shot from that shoot, where it looks very candid and it's very natural type of an image just of him holding onto that rod, you know, of the rig, and you can kind of see all of his muscle definition and so forth. So my point here is, once you have the light set up, don't just shoot one shot. Move, pose, frame, and then last step is analyze your highlights and shadows. And the big deal here, when you're analyzing, you want to zoom in and look closely at where the highlights and the shadows are falling, because an image might look perfectly fine on the back of your screen. And then you put it on your computer and you're like, oh my gosh, there's a giant shadow cast right over the person's face because, you know, her fiance blocked that light and there's a shadow over half the girl's face. That's a problem, and it's actually difficult to see in camera. So you need to pause. If you're not tethering, like you're not in a studio and it's not convenient to tether, pause after every major light setup. Zoom in, look at the highlights and the shadows on the image, and then continue shooting. With every major change in camera to subject position. Okay, so number one, with a change in camera to subject position, with a change in subject position, or with a change in lighting position. With those three changes, change any one of those things, and I want you to do the same thing, analyze your highlights and shadows, okay? So these are the 8 steps of how we basically work from just approaching a scene and not really knowing where we want to go and then getting to that final image. And by the way, when you get into this stuff, when you get into the groove, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to go in this order. You can break things and put them in whatever order you want, but when you're learning, it really helps to have a process like this to go through. Every single time it's a challenge, and every single time it's one that, you know, we're confident that we can resolve because we've been in this situation so many times. And with these steps and with a little bit of practice, you're gonna find the exact same thing. So let's go ahead and move into the next video where we're gonna start analyzing each of our scenes and showing you these techniques in practice.